Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima, Ukrainian American, reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 184 of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this is the second week of September 2025. In today's podcast, Russia takes a further step in the war against the West. So, Russian drones attacked Poland and how the West has responded. Last week, 2 dozen Russian drones entered Poland airspace overnight on September 10, prompting NATO to scramble fighter jets to shut them down in what West officials described on Wednesday as a dangerous escalation of the war in the neighboring Ukraine. It was the first time in the history of NATO that alliance fighters had engaged enemy targets in Allied airspace. The drone incursion prompted Poland's government to invoke Article 4 of the NATO treaty, a rarely used mechanism triggered when a member is under threat that prompts a formal decision within the alliance. NATO fighter jets shot down multiple Russian drones, as reported 20, that entered Polish airspace during an attack on neighboring Ukraine early Wednesday, as the military alliance condemned Moscow for absolutely dangerous behavior that escalated tensions. This was the first time that NATO fired shots since the war in Ukraine began. Polish and Dutch jets intercepted the drones with help from Italian, German, and NATO multinational forces. After the drone attack on September 10, Poland realized it was not at all prepared to defend against these seemingly simple strike drones. Poland has a unique situation. It's probably the only country actively developing its own air defense specifically to counter potential attacks from the Russian Federation. First, the Poles purchased the Patriot air defense systems. Second, they built their own automated Vizsla system with multiple subsystems. However, they weren't ready for the specific types of ammunition, like strike drones. In other words, Poland was preparing to defend against cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, or aircraft raids. They were less prepared for the arrival of completely different types of weapons. And you would ask why? So, let me explain. When, say, a Gerber type drone approaches, air defense radars and aircraft radars often can't detect it. The situation with the Shahed drones is slightly better. They travel at over 200 kilometers per hour, while Gerbers fly at about 120 kilometers per hour, making them difficult for pulse Doppler radar to detect. In fact, a significant number of the drones that intercepted Poland were Gerbers. So now Russians knew what to do. Russians analyzed the Poland air defense systems and chosen to use the right drones. We are optimized to combat drones. We have systems like the Gepard radar guided artillery systems and several German Skynex systems, which are also radar guided artillery. We operate mobile units and electronic warfare systems designed to jam the frequencies used by Shahid's navigation systems. Additionally, we have multiple small portable systems mounted on trailers capable of detecting and attacking and tracking Shaheeds. We also utilize acoustic detection systems that identify the characteristic sounds of Shaheeds, providing crucial information to the air defense control systems about the flight paths. Essentially, we have everything ready and optimized. Poland, at the same time, doesn't have those systems. They will need to start from scratch, beginning with the Shahid detection systems. Their inability to detect and track those drones remain a weak point. Radars used for anti aircraft missile systems, reconnaissance stations, or guidance stations typically don't perform well against drones. We all saw Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's call for Polish colleagues, offering Ukraine's expertise on how to combat Shaheeds. He made this proposal because we hope Poland will take more effective action. If we provide specialists, perhaps the Poles will become more active in shooting down drones approaching their territory. Looking at the drone flight paths on September 10, they entered Poland along the border from Belarus and returned toward northwestern Ukraine. That area includes Yavorin training ground in Lviv and Chervonograd, where there was a electricity power plant. It is uncertain what might have happened if Poland hadn't reacted and dismissed the drones as flights back to Ukraine. But they didn't shoot some down this time. Therefore, we should support them in this effort, and Ukraine will help them to do so. What did they do before? A cruise missile flew in, traveled 100 kilometers past Warsaw, nearly reaching the border with Germany, and they just watched. Now, at least to some degree, they have become more active. Maybe because Dutch F 35 planes took off and shot them down. Maybe for other reasons. But if the Poles start shooting down drone shots over their own territory, not to mention the area near the eastern border, that would be great. Because the Russians are using the opportunity to enter our cities and important facilities from the west. In fact, from Poland. It's clear we won't place anti aircraft missile systems there, so we're limiting their range by half, and they will only cover a semicircle instead of a full circle. If the Poles take on the task of shooting down drones over their own land, it could make our task easier or prevent the Russians from using routes through Poland to strike western Ukraine. If this route doesn't work, then everything turns out fine for us. The Russians will no longer set up roads to approach our key facilities in western Ukraine from the west. That means they should abandon these routes. Or, if they think that they say only 4 out of 19 Shaheeds that flew into the Polish territory were shot down, they should reconsider and try it again. So, but most likely, the Russians will be more cautious. They don't want to rush in either, because they realize that if this becomes a common tactic, they risk a massive raid on Poland, followed by another, then a third. NATO would then allow its air defense to operate over western Ukraine, which Russians don't want. Poland itself might start shooting down Russian drones and cruise missiles approaching its borders, and that's not in the Russia's best interest. So the attack on Poland wasn't random, and I think the Kremlin has a long-term plan. The Kremlin aims to show that Ukraine's Western allies are powerless against Russian determination. On September 10, NATO fighter jets scrambled over eastern Poland to defend the alliance members' airspace from Russian drones. The attack marks a serious escalation by Moscow, but it also highlights once again that the West lacks clear red lines and is not ready to respond firmly if previously inviolable boundaries, such as NATO member states' territorial integrity, are crossed. This latest Russian escalation isn't just empty words. Just last week, Russian dictator Putin warned that foreign troops in Ukraine could become legitimate target for Russian forces. He clarified that this would be especially true while the fighting continues. The message was clear. Russia opposes any international security agreements that include Western troops in Ukraine. Russia has often stated this before, but Putin's threats against Western troops clearly raise the stakes. However, these aren't the only ways the Kremlin has increased pressure recently. Russia has maintained its military offensive in Ukraine and gained strength from diplomatic successes. On the battlefield, Russia still has the upper hand in personnel and military equipment, while NATO barely managed to respond to a rate of only 1920 drones. Ukraine has faced an intense aerial campaign for months, for years, almost every night, involving hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles. The attacks are more brazen, with a recent rocket hitting the Ukrainian government building in Kiev 2 weeks ago. They are more deadly, with civilian casualties rising. Like previous years, Russia continues to attack Ukraine's energy infrastructure, signaling a tough winter ahead. On the ground, Russian gains have been limited, but Ukraine has retaken strategic territory near the key city of Pokrovsk in Donetsk. Yet, and this is the key for Putin's messaging, Russia is making slow progress at great costs. But still, for Putin, it is a progress. So, Putin's strategy. On the diplomatic front, Putin received a significant support at the annual Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin, China. Bilateral agreements were signed with China, the biggest Russian supporter and ally. Putin likely felt encouraged by the display of comrade of Kim Jong Un and Xi Jinping during the September 3 military parade celebrating China's victory over Japan in World War II. The Russian president can now be more confident than even that his allies will back him, economically, like China and India, and militarily, like North Korea. So, beyond by such successes, and convinced that his war machine will not suddenly stall, Putin felt confident enough to declare that he was ready to agree on an acceptable option to end the war against Ukraine, or else he will achieve his goals by armed means. However, Putin's idea of negotiated end to the war is misleading. In reality, he wants Ukraine and its Western allies to accept his long standing demands: territory concessions, rejections of NATO membership, and no Western support for any peace deal. This layered pressure campaign from Russia isn't just an coincidence or luck. It's part of calculated effort to keep Russia relevant in what's likely to be a future bipolar world dominated by the United States and China. While Putin has accepted Chinese influence in Asia, he still sees chances for Russia to dominate Europe and to regain some of its Soviet era influence. To do this, the Kremlin needs to show that Ukraine's Western partners are powerless against Russian resolve. So far, Putin has succeeded. Russia has ignored all deadlines and ultimatums set by US President Donald Trump, and this is the fact. Trump responded to the Russian drones in Polish airspace with a brief comment on his social media platform Truth, which showed more surprise than a real reaction to what could quickly escalate into a major crisis. Meanwhile, Trump has not yet supported a bipartisan bill in the US Senate to increase sanctions pressure on Russia. So, what was the response to the Russian attack from the West? While European leaders quickly and forcefully condemned this latest Russian provocation, their response remained mostly rhetorical. Poland merely called for NATO's Article 4 consultations among alliance members. However, the outcome of those talks was mostly a mild statement from NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, saying that a full assessment of the incident is ongoing and that the alliance will closely monitor the situation on eastern flank, and our air defense forces will remain on a high alert. In the statement, European Foreign Affairs Chief Kaja Kallas expressed solidarity with Poland and promised to further increase the price for Moscow by significantly strengthening sanctions against Kremlin and its proxies. Considering that the EU is already working on 18 sanctions package and the war in Ukraine continues, it's unlikely that there will be any major changes. Delivered the morning after the Russian drone incursion to Poland, Ursula von der Leyen annual State of the Country address offered little more than reaffirmation of the European Union goal to be able to take care of its own defense and security. They simply keep on talking, talking, talking without any firm actions. Russia might be trying to intimidate NATO countries into agreeing to a de facto weakening of the alliance security vis a vis Poland and other NATO members, such as Baltic states, Romania, which Moscow will still consider as part of its sphere of influence. Russia is seeking to extend the gray zone of instability as far west as possible. By threatening to spread the conflict to Poland, Russia is seeking tacit Western acquiescences to its claims to dominance over Ukraine. But hanging over Ukraine to Putin would be only a prelude to further Russian expansion westward. Russia is likely overestimating its strength. The good news is that Dutch F-35 fighter jets were scrambled on alert, and other allied forces have also responded. Russia's attack could be a test for how NATO forces will respond. If the Western allies show resolve, Putin could fail. And moreover, it's highly likely to be attacked if the West demonstrates its strength. NATO allies and members of the coalition of the willing must determine what additional forces, if any, are needed to protect allies. Consideration should also be given to moving to a strategy of preventive defense. For example, establishing air defense systems on the territory and in the airspace of Ukraine to respond to Russia's latest attacks. The West must fight back, and not just with words. Russia is engaged in sabotage and assassination in and against Europe. Now is not the time to try to smooth out the conflict, as the advocates of detente with the aggressive Soviet Union tried to do 50 years ago. Now is the time to put into practice the principle of peace through strength. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, share with your friends.